Some towns decide a person's fate long before the truth ever arrives. The morning sun over Red Hollow climbed slowly above the dry hills, turning the dust in the main street into a pale golden haze that drifted lazily between weathered storefronts and hitching posts worn smooth by years of restless horses. In the center of the square stood a rough wooden gallows built from sun-bleached beams that looked older than the town itself, and beneath it a small crowd had gathered, boots scraping softly against packed dirt as murmurs rolled through them like wine through tall grass. They said it was justice. They said it was necessary. But most of them had never once laid eyes on the moment they claimed to understand. On the wooden platform stood a woman the town barely knew, her hands bound with coarse rope, her dark hair lifted slightly by the dry prairie breeze. Her name was Naeli, and the only thing the people of Red Hollow believed they knew about her was that she was Apache and that she had arrived in town the same night a ranch hand named Abel Mercer was found dead near the river crossing 2 miles south of town. That coincidence had been enough. Fear, after all, travels faster than truth in places like this. Sheriff Jonah Pike stood a few feet away, hat low, one hand resting against the worn railing of the platform. He had measured this square 100 times in his life, but today it felt smaller, like the walls of the town were closing in around him. The crowd kept growing. Ranchers, store clerks, travelers passing through, each one repeating the same story until it sounded solid enough to stand on. Someone whispered that Mercer's horse had been missing. Someone else swore they had seen Naeli walking alone along the trail before sunrise. None of it was proof, but proof had never been the thing people wanted most. What they wanted was certainty, and certainty was easier when it came with a face. Naeli said nothing. She did not plead, and she did not shout. She simply stood there with a stillness that made some of the quieter townsfolk uneasy, as if her silence carried a weight they could not name. In her hand, half hidden by the rope binding her wrists, she held a small silver pendant shaped like a crescent moon, its surface worn smooth by years of travel. The wind shifted again, carrying the scent of dry sage across the square. Sheriff Pike cleared his throat, but the sound barely rose above the murmurs. Then somewhere beyond the edge of town, faint at first and almost mistaken for thunder, came the slow rhythm of hoofbeats rolling across the hard desert road. One rider, steady, unhurried. A few heads turned toward the horizon where a lone figure was beginning to emerge from the drifting dust, the horse moving with the calm confidence of an animal that had traveled many miles under the open sky. The rider's hat cast a shadow across his face, and as he guided the horse toward the square, the sound of those hoofbeats carried a quiet kind of authority that the crowd had not expected. No one knew his name yet. No one knew why he had come. But before the rope above the gallows could move even an inch, the stranger's horse stopped at the edge of the gathering, and the rider looked slowly from the platform to the faces in the crowd, then back again to the woman standing beneath the beam. And in that moment, the certainty that had filled Red Hollow all morning began, just barely, to crack. The stranger did not rush his horse. In places like Red Hollow, rushing was how men started trouble, and the rider did not look like a man who wasted motion. The animal stepped forward through the dust with slow, measured confidence, each hoof settling into the hard street as though it had traveled 1,000 miles of similar towns and knew exactly what kind of silence waited at the end of this one. People began to shift aside without being asked. A few stepped back from the gallows platform, their boots scraping against the ground, because something about the way the rider carried himself made the square feel suddenly smaller. Sheriff Jonah Pike watched the approach carefully. He had spent 15 years wearing a badge in towns that lived and died on rumor, and he knew the difference between a drifter and a man who had seen enough of the world to understand how quickly crowds could turn. The rider stopped 10 yards from the platform and rested one gloved hand on the saddle horn. His coat was coated with pale trail dust, the kind that gathered after riding 20 or 30 miles through dry country. A long rifle sat quiet in the scabbard beside his leg, but the man made no move toward it. Instead, he lifted his eyes slowly toward the platform. Naeli noticed him at the same moment the rest of the town did. The stranger's face remained calm beneath the shadow of his hat, but there was something steady in the way he studied the gallows, the rope, and the gathered faces around them. He looked not like a man surprised by what he saw, but like someone who had arrived expecting it. Ezra Cole was the first to break the silence. He stood near the front of the crowd, arms folded across his chest, voice loud enough to carry across the square. He told the rider that the town was handling its own business, and that strangers would do well to keep riding. Several men nodded, grateful that someone had spoken before the quiet grew heavier. But the rider did not move. He slid one boot from the stirrup and stepped down from the saddle with unhurried ease, dust falling from the hem of his coat as his boots touched the ground. A few townsfolk exchanged uneasy looks because he did not behave like someone who felt outnumbered. Sheriff Pike watched him walk forward slowly, each step steady, until he stood where the entire square could see him clearly. The man finally spoke, and when he did, his voice carried calm authority rather than anger. He asked a simple question that drifted through the morning air and settled over the crowd like a sudden shadow. He asked which person in the town had actually seen the woman commit the crime they were about to punish. For a moment, nobody answered. A few people shifted their weight. Someone coughed. The same voices that had been loud only minutes earlier now struggled to speak with certainty. Ezra Cole tried to respond first, repeating the rumors that had been spreading since sunrise, but the rider did not raise his voice to argue. He only listened, eyes moving from one face to another, patient as a man who knew that truth rarely needed to shout. Sheriff Pike felt something tighten in his chest as the quiet deepened. Because for the first time that morning, the town of Red Hollow realized that the story it had been repeating might not hold together once someone bothered to look closely at it. The silence that followed the stranger's question did not break all at once. It cracked slowly, like dry earth after a long summer without rain. One man cleared his throat. Another looked down at the dust near his boots as though the ground might suddenly offer the answer he needed. The crowd that had stood so confidently only moments before now shifted in uneasy waves, each person waiting for someone else to speak first. The rider watched them patiently, his eyes calm beneath the brim of his hat. Sheriff Jonah Pike felt the weight of that quiet more than anyone. He had heard Ezra Cole and the others repeat the same story since dawn, yet when the stranger asked the question out loud, the sheriff realized he had never heard a single witness say they had seen the moment with their own eyes. Ezra Cole finally stepped forward again, eager to regain the confidence that had begun slipping away. His voice carried across the square with practiced certainty as he explained that Abel Mercer had been found near the river crossing 2 miles south of town, and that Naeli had been spotted walking the trail before sunrise. He spoke about the missing horse and the tracks leading toward town, repeating the details that had spread from porch to porch since morning. The rider listened without interrupting. When Ezra finished, the stranger nodded slowly, as though measuring the weight of every word. Then he asked another quiet question. He asked whether any man in the square had actually seen the woman touch Abel Mercer or take the horse that everyone claimed was stolen. Once again, the answer was silence. A breeze drifted through the street, carrying a faint scent of sage and dust across the platform. Naeli stood as she had from the beginning, shoulders straight, eyes steady, her bound hand still holding the small silver pendant that glinted softly in the sunlight. She had listened to every accusation without speaking, and the calm in her posture made several people in the crowd shift uncomfortably. Sheriff Pike noticed the pendant again and felt a strange thought pass through his mind. A person expecting death did not usually hold on to something like that unless it meant something far beyond the moment. The stranger finally turned his attention to the sheriff. His voice remained calm, but there was a firmness behind it that carried easily across the square. He asked Sheriff Pike whether the law of the territory allowed a person to face punishment without proof or witnesses. The sheriff hesitated before answering. He knew the law well enough to understand the question was not meant to embarrass him. It was meant to remind the entire town what justice was supposed to look like. Pike removed his hat slowly and ran a hand through his hair as the crowd watched him. He admitted that no one had come forward with a direct witness. Ezra Cole stepped in quickly, insisting that the evidence was obvious and that the town had already decided what must be done. But the stranger did not raise his voice. He only glanced toward the dusty road leading south toward the river crossing. Then he looked back at the crowd and spoke again, this time with quiet certainty. He said that stories told in the heat of fear often sounded convincing until someone walked the trail where the truth had actually happened. And the way he said it made several people in Red Hollow realize that the stranger might be the first man that morning willing to follow that trail before deciding a woman's fate. The stranger's words did not sound like a challenge, yet they hung in the air with the weight of one. A few men near the front of the square exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier confidence beginning to fade beneath the calm certainty in the rider's voice. Ezra Cole felt it slipping too, and he did not like the feeling. He stepped forward again, boots pressing hard into the dust, as though he could push the doubt back into the ground where it belonged. He insisted that the town did not need a trail followed by an outsider to understand what had already been decided. According to him, the situation was simple. Abel Mercer had been found near the river crossing shortly after sunrise. Naeli had been seen walking the road not long before that. The horse Mercer rode was gone, and the tracks pointed toward Red Hollow. That was enough for Ezra. It had been enough for the town only minutes earlier. But the stranger did not argue. Instead, he turned slowly and looked across the gathered faces, studying them one by one as though searching for something that had been buried beneath the noise. His calm made people uncomfortable because it suggested patience, and patience had a way of uncovering things that hurried judgment preferred to leave alone. Sheriff Jonah Pike noticed it first. Several townsfolk who had shouted the loudest earlier were no longer speaking. One man scratched the back of his neck and stepped away from the platform. Another shifted behind a wagon wheel, as if the wood might shield him from the growing uncertainty. The stranger spoke again, and his voice carried easily across the square without needing to rise. He said that a man who had ridden 30 miles across dry country learned to read the ground the same way a book could be read. Tracks, dust, broken grass along the trail, all of it told a story to anyone willing to slow down long enough to listen. And he added that stories written on the earth rarely matched the ones repeated in a crowd. Ezra Cole let out a short laugh meant to sound confident, but it landed awkwardly in the quiet street. He asked the stranger whether he believed a single rider passing through town knew more than the people who actually lived there. The stranger did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the southern road again, the road that wound through sage and dry creek beds before reaching the river crossing where Abel Mercer had last been seen. When he finally spoke, his tone remained steady and calm. He said that sometimes the distance between a lie and the truth was no more than 2 miles of empty trail, and anyone who truly wanted justice would not fear walking that distance. The words settled over Red Hollow like a slow-moving cloud. Sheriff Pike looked from the stranger to the platform, where Naeli still stood with quiet dignity, the silver pendant resting against the rope binding her hands. The sheriff felt a thought rising in his mind that he could no longer push away. If the rider was right, then the town had been ready to make a decision before the story had even been finished. And for the first time that morning, the people gathered in the dusty square began to wonder whether the real answer to Abel Mercer's death might still be waiting somewhere along that lonely road outside town. The wind shifted again across the square, carrying the faint creak of the gallows beam and the distant cry of a hawk circling somewhere above the dry hills. The town of Red Hollow had grown quieter than it had been all morning. Sheriff Jonah Pike could feel it in the way people were no longer standing shoulder to shoulder with the same certainty. Some had taken a step back. Others had lowered their voices to whispers. Doubt had begun moving through the crowd the way dust moved through the street. Slow at first, but impossible to stop once the breeze caught it. The stranger stood where he had stopped moments earlier, hands resting loosely at his sides, his horse waiting patiently behind him as though it had seen many towns pause like this before. He looked once more toward the road leading south to the river crossing, measuring the distance in his mind. 2 miles. Perhaps a little more if the trail curved along the dry creek bed. Not far for a man on horseback, but far enough that no one in the square had bothered to ride out and see what the ground itself might say. Ezra Cole noticed the shift in the crowd and felt the control he had carried since dawn slipping through his fingers. His voice rose sharper now as he insisted that the town did not need a stranger lecturing them about trails and dust. He reminded everyone that Mercer had been a known man in Red Hollow, someone who had traded here for years. Naeli, on the other hand, was a traveler no one knew, someone who had arrived quietly and offered no explanation for why she had been near the river before sunrise. To Ezra, that was reason enough. Several men nodded, though not with the same confidence as before. The stranger turned his head slightly and regarded Ezra for a long moment, studying the man not with anger but with the quiet attention of someone piecing together a puzzle. Then he spoke again, calmly enough that even the wind seemed to pause to listen. He said that strangers were often blamed because they were convenient. A town could place its fear on a person passing through and believe the danger had been solved. But the land rarely cooperated with that kind of story. The land remembered every hoofprint, every turn of a wagon wheel, every place where a horse had been led instead of ridden. Sheriff Pike looked up at that. The rider's words carried the sound of experience, and Pike had heard enough stories from trail riders and trackers to know that what the man was describing was not guesswork. It was skill. The sheriff glanced toward the southern road again and imagined the dry soil along the river crossing, the patches of grass flattened by hooves, the shallow prints left in the sand where the trail curved near the water. Those things would still be there if someone bothered to look. The stranger shifted his gaze back to the platform, where Naeli stood quietly beneath the beam. She had not spoken once since he arrived, yet something in her calm presence seemed to strengthen the silence around her, as though she trusted that the truth did not require shouting to be heard. The stranger nodded almost imperceptibly, then turned back to the sheriff. He asked a simple question that carried across the entire square. He asked whether Sheriff Pike was willing to let the trail speak before the rope did. The words settled into the dust of Red Hollow and stayed there. For a long moment the sheriff did not answer. Then he slowly placed his hat back on his head and looked out over the uneasy crowd. Because deep down he knew that if the truth waited 2 miles down that road, then the town had no right to pretend it had already found it. The square remained suspended in a quiet that no one had expected when the morning began. Sheriff Jonah Pike stood beside the platform with his jaw tight, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes in Red Hollow settle on him. The stranger's questions still lingered in the air like dust that refused to settle. Whether the sheriff would allow the trail to speak before the rope decided everything. Pike looked from the crowd to Naeli, who stood beneath the weathered beam with calm steadiness, the silver pendant resting against her bound hands and catching a thin blade of sunlight. Then he looked toward the southern road that wound away from town through pale sage and dry ground toward the river crossing where Abel Mercer had last been seen. 2 miles of open land. 2 miles that no one had bothered to ride that morning. Ezra Cole stepped forward again, his voice sharper now, the edge of urgency creeping into it. He insisted that delaying would only invite trouble. According to him, the evidence was already clear. Mercer had been found near the river. Naeli had been seen walking the trail before sunrise. The missing horse and the tracks were enough. He said the town had already reached its conclusion and that letting a stranger stir doubt would only weaken their resolve. Several men nodded, but their agreement sounded uncertain now, like an echo that had lost its source. The stranger did not argue. He simply rested one hand on the saddle behind him and studied the sheriff with the quiet patience of someone who understood that real decisions were rarely made by the loudest voices. His horse shifted slightly in the dust, ears flicking toward the wind that carried the faint smell of water from the distant river. Sheriff Pike finally took a slow breath. He had worn the badge long enough to know that justice was not supposed to be easy. It was supposed to be careful, yet the town had been moving too fast since dawn, pushed forward by fear and the need for an answer before anyone had time to ask the right questions. The sheriff removed his hat and wiped a thin line of sweat from his brow. When he spoke, his voice was steady, though the square leaned in to hear every word. He said that Red Hollow had always claimed to be a town that respected the law of the territory, and the law did not decide a person's fate without proof. He looked directly at Ezra Cole when he said it, and the meaning behind the words settled heavily between them. A murmur moved through the crowd as people realized what the sheriff was about to do. Pike turned toward the stranger and nodded once, slow and deliberate. Then he announced that the platform would wait and that he intended to ride to the river crossing himself before the town made any final decision. The statement traveled through the square like a sudden gust of wind. Some people looked relieved. Others looked uneasy. Ezra Cole opened his mouth as if to protest, but the sheriff raised one hand and silenced him with a glance that carried more authority than it had earlier that morning. The stranger inclined his head slightly, not in triumph, but in quiet agreement. Naeli lifted her eyes toward the sheriff for the first time since the rider had arrived, and though she still said nothing, the calm in her expression deepened. Because somewhere beyond the dusty edge of Red Hollow, the land still held the truth of what had happened at the river crossing. And now, for the first time that day, someone was finally willing to go and listen to it. The decision traveled through Red Hollow like a slow thunder rolling across distant hills. Sheriff Jonah Pike stepped down from the platform and walked toward the hitching rail where his horse waited, the leather saddle creaking softly as the animal shifted its weight. The crowd parted without being asked, creating a narrow path through the dusty street. Moments earlier, many of them had stood ready for the rope to decide everything. Now they watched the sheriff with uncertain faces, realizing that the answer they had believed so firmly might still be waiting somewhere beyond town. The stranger remained near the edge of the square, quiet and observant, as though he had seen this moment play out before in other places where fear had spoken too quickly. Ezra Cole did not move aside as easily as the others. His jaw tightened and his voice rose again, telling the sheriff that the town was wasting time chasing signs in the dirt. He insisted that the trail would show nothing new, that the situation had already been settled by common sense. But Sheriff Pike did not slow his steps. He reached his horse and rested one hand on the saddle before turning back toward the crowd. His eyes moved across the gathered faces, lingering for a moment on Ezra Cole before settling again on the gallows platform. Naeli still stood there with the same quiet dignity she had carried since morning. The silver pendant glinted softly against the rope binding her wrists. Pike spoke calmly, reminding the town that Red Hollow had survived as long as it had because the law was supposed to stand taller than rumor. He said that if the trail showed the same story the town believed, then the answer would be clear. But if the trail told something different, the town deserved to know before making a mistake that could not be undone. The words hung over the square with the weight of plain truth. A few townsfolk nodded slowly. Others looked down, perhaps remembering how quickly the crowd had formed when the first accusation had been spoken. The stranger finally stepped forward again, his boots pressing softly into the dust as he approached the sheriff's horse. He did not ask permission. He simply rested a hand on the saddle horn and said that the ground near a river crossing held tracks longer than most people realized, especially when the night air stayed dry. His voice carried the calm certainty of a man who had followed many trails across the frontier. Sheriff Pike studied him for a moment before giving a small nod. The sheriff understood that two sets of eyes might read the land more clearly than one. Ezra Cole watched the exchange with growing tension in his posture, though he said nothing more. Around them, the square of Red Hollow had become unusually still. Even the wind seemed to pause among the wooden storefronts. Pike mounted his horse and turned it toward the southern road. The stranger swung easily into his own saddle a moment later. Together they guided their horses toward the edge of town, where the dusty trail stretched out between pale sage and sunlit hills. Behind them, the crowd remained gathered around the platform, waiting in uneasy silence. Naeli lifted her eyes toward the departing riders, and for the first time that morning a faint hint of relief touched her expression. Because somewhere along that quiet stretch of land the earth still held the story of what had truly happened at the river crossing, and now two riders were finally on their way to listen to it. The trail south of Red Hollow stretched across dry country, where the wind had spent years learning how to speak through dust and sage. Sheriff Jonah Pike and the stranger rode side by side beneath the high morning sun, their horses moving at a steady pace as the town slowly disappeared behind them. The road dipped through shallow ridges of pale earth and patches of brittle grass that whispered softly whenever the breeze passed through. Neither man spoke for the first mile. Out here the land carried a different kind of quiet, one that asked a rider to pay attention. After a while the stranger slowed his horse and leaned slightly forward in the saddle, studying the ground where the trail curved toward a narrow stretch of sand near the riverbank. The sheriff followed his gaze. At first the path looked ordinary, the kind of trail crossed by dozens of horses every week. But when they dismounted and walked a few steps closer, the details began to appear. Hoofprints pressed into the dry soil at uneven angles, one set deeper than the others. The stranger crouched down, brushing a small layer of dust aside with the edge of his glove. He pointed quietly to the marks where a horse had been led rather than ridden. The sheriff noticed it immediately once the stranger showed him. The prints were narrow and close together, the pattern of an animal being guided on foot. Pike frowned slightly because Abel Mercer had been known as a strong rider who rarely walked beside his horse. The stranger followed the marks another few yards where the trail bent toward the river crossing. The ground there was softer, and the signs became clearer. Two sets of boots had pressed into the sand beside the hoofprints, one pair heavier than the other. The sheriff measured the distance with his eyes and realized something that did not match the story told in town. If Naeli had been leading Mercer's horse away alone, there should have been only one set of footprints beside the animal. Instead, the sand showed the path of two men moving together along the edge of the riverbank. Pike stood quietly for a moment, letting the truth settle in his mind. The stranger did not rush him. He only pointed toward another detail a few feet away where the trail widened near the water. A second horse had waited there for some time. The pattern of hooves pressed deep into the sand showed where the animal had turned slowly in place before leaving the crossing and heading back toward town. Sheriff Pike looked up slowly, his expression changing as the pieces of the morning's story began to rearrange themselves. The land had spoken exactly the way the stranger said it would. Naeli had not been alone at the river. Someone else had been there. Someone who had returned to Red Hollow before the town ever realized the truth had been left behind in the dust. The sheriff rose and turned toward the northern road leading back to town, his jaw tightening with quiet understanding. Because the trail had just revealed something the crowd had never considered. The real answer to Abel Mercer's death had ridden back into Red Hollow long before the accusations had begun. The ride back to Red Hollow felt shorter than the journey out, though neither Sheriff Jonah Pike nor the stranger pushed their horses faster than a steady pace. The sun had climbed higher now, burning the morning haze away and leaving the land sharp and clear beneath the wide western sky. Pike's mind replayed the tracks they had seen near the river crossing. Two sets of boots, a horse led on foot, another horse waiting nearby before turning back toward town. The ground had spoken with quiet honesty, and the story it told did not belong to Naeli. As the buildings of Red Hollow appeared again on the horizon, the sheriff noticed something else waiting there. The crowd had not dispersed. Men and women still gathered in the dusty square, standing in uneasy silence around the wooden platform, as if the entire town had been holding its breath since the riders left. Naeli remained where she had been that morning, calm and steady beneath the weathered beam, the silver pendant still resting against her bound hands. Ezra Cole stood near the front of the crowd, though the confidence that had filled his voice earlier had faded into a watchful tension. When the sheriff and the stranger rode into the square, every eye turned toward them. Sheriff Pike dismounted slowly and removed his hat, brushing the dust from its brim before stepping forward. He did not raise his voice, yet the quiet carried his words across the entire street. He told the town that the trail near the river crossing had answered the question everyone had been arguing about since sunrise. The land showed that Abel Mercer had not been alone when he reached the water. Another man had been there with him, walking beside the horse and returning toward Red Hollow afterward. A murmur moved through the crowd as people looked from one another to Ezra Cole and back again. Pike continued calmly, explaining that the tracks in the sand did not match the story that had spread through town. Naeli had been blamed because she was the easiest name to point at. But the earth itself had left behind a different record, one that could not be changed by rumor or fear. The sheriff stepped onto the platform and loosened the rope binding Naeli's hands. The fibers fell away quietly, and for the first time that day the crowd seemed to understand how close they had come to making a mistake that would have followed Red Hollow for the rest of its years. Naeli lowered her hand slowly and held the small silver pendant for a moment before letting it rest against her palm. She looked at the sheriff, then at the stranger standing near the edge of the square. The rider gave only a slight nod, as though he had simply done what any traveler should do when the truth had been left waiting on a lonely trail. Sheriff Pike turned back toward the gathered townsfolk and spoke one final time, reminding them that justice was never meant to be rushed by fear. Out on the frontier, a rope could be tied in minutes, but the truth sometimes waited miles away in quiet places where only patience could find it. The crowd began to disperse slowly, each person leaving the square with heavier thoughts than they had brought that morning. The gallows beam stood silent above the empty platform, moving gently in the wind. And in the drifting dust of Red Hollow, the town learned that the strongest voice in the West was not the loudest accusation, but the quiet truth written in the land itself.